And welcome everyone. I'm very happy and grateful that you're here. And in the previous presentation on the Silk Road, we focused on luxury textiles, and silk carpets such as this were an undeniable luxury textile industry in Central Asia. And the singular ornamentation patterns of the carpets are a nice segue into, sorry, the page needs to shift. Into the carpet pages of the Book of Kells, which is in Trinity College, Dublin. And it's one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts in the world, along with the other one that's very famous is in the Morgan Library, the Prayer Book of Claude de France. And the reason I'm bringing this is that books were luxury items, especially illuminated manuscripts such as this, because without passion, this level of luxury is absolutely inaccessible. Books such as these illuminated manuscripts are set in the language of time, of learning, of generations, of respect, of perseverance, patience, and also humility to make such things, these artistry that skip the brain and caress our senses. It's something else. And we find these manuscripts in libraries, such as the Beinecke at Yale University, and also at St. Gall in Switzerland. And I am delighted to share the story with you along with my co-host and presenter, Dr. Tasha Warderstrasse from the Oriental Institute. And Tasha, it's a joy to work with you. And I know you've actually handled some of these manuscripts in some of these libraries. Would you share some details about this?
I think what people don't realize is the sheer terror that you feel when someone hands you a 13th century illuminated manuscript and just gives it to you. And you're just sort of like, what do I do? What if I sneeze on it? What if I drop it? Oh, the sense of responsibility, it is frightening.
Well, today we're going to talk about the influence of Silk Road on this concept of illuminated manuscripts through the lens of a collector. So how does a collector go about the concept story of acquisition, of production, of deconstruction, and genealogy? And these books are truly a marvel. And Nourishment Project pivots on scholarship. And some of the books that has informed us is listed here. If anyone wants access to this, please send me an email and we'll be happy to share this with you. And the Silk Roads, just as a cap, is fundamentally and have remained trade networks spanning geographies and effectively millennia. They are still around. China has invested almost $1 trillion in the Belt and Road Initiative. A big chunk of that is the digital Silk Road. So whenever we do online shopping, we are part of the Silk Road tradition. And these books are a marvel because they don't only show up in museums and libraries, you will also get them in auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's. This one sold for $8.8 million. And look at the marvel of the Chinese burnished gold paper. You will get them in turquoise, in pink, in blue. And the roundels we see here reminds us of the roundel patterns that came before the Mongols took over. And this is the Akyunlu Quran, which is called the Timurid Quran. And Tasha, you wanted to talk about this manuscript?
Yes, I particularly wanted to bring people's attention to this manuscript because, when we think about Islamic art, we often think of Islamic art as being geometric art. But as we can see here, Islamic art is also clearly figural art with figures and people. And in this case, showing the birth of the Prophet Muhammad here, clearly inspired by the Christian nativity scene. But I really sort of wanted to draw your attention to this as we talk about what we think of art in this period is.
Okay, and then books or manuscripts come in many materials. You could have them in papyri, in parchment, which is animal skin, the membrane, vellum, which is well known in the devotional books, are specifically calf skin. You also get them in birch bark, in palm leaves. This book is a very famous one of the most famous illuminated manuscripts. This is the Black Hours. There's only one of 7 in the world. This happens to be at the Morgan. Morgan has a great collection. It's rare. It's only 7 because the vellum was treated in an iron copper solution that gives it the black of the background. But the process of creating this background black is very corrosive. It's also supremely expensive. And it's probably attributed to the atelier of Willem Vreeland, a Flemish illustrator. And the other treasure of the Morgan is the Lindau Gospel. Lindau, because it at one point resided in the Lindau, the town of Lindau in Germany. I mean, these books are a marvel. If you look at the treasured bindings, it's bejeweled. And these raised bumps are bosses. These represent if you open up the book, because they have emeralds and sapphires and garnet, the color of Christ. So the gold figure of Christ is never going to touch the book on the ground. And these bosses also represents the cloisters you see in a medieval church. And these books, as Tasha will point out soon, are meant to be used, which is evidenced by the break you see in the binding on the side. There's about, I think, 320 plus jewels on here. But the real use is that it's made to impress. Imagine on a Sunday, the priest, probably wearing those luxury textiles we had spoken of before, silk, velvet. He holds the book in service where the sun streams in through the stained glass window, falls on the book. It's dazzling. The book is made to just symbolize the radiance of the Lord. And as the book dazzles, it illuminates the devotee himself or herself. And this also is at the Morgan. And so I think this is a nice time to go into the story of acquisition. How does one go about acquiring books of this importance that capture humanity so well? And at this point, we will start around the 19th century because there were many countries that was fighting for influence in the Central Asian regions and Middle East regions that coincides with the proverbial Silk Road. Countries such as England, France, Germany, Russia. Imagine that we are in 1889. At this point, the British East India Company is firmly established in India, and a Scottish explorer, Andrew Dalglish, has been murdered. I love stories like this. And he's been murdered by an Afghan named Dad Muhammad, and the British captain, Captain Hamilton Bower, is tracks him down to this area of the Taklamakan Desert. And an antiquities dealer approaches him and he buys a document from him. He brings the document back to India, Calcutta actually, the Royal Society, the Royal Asiatic Society, where there's a scholar there, A.F. Rudolph Hornley, who deciphers the document. It's a document of birch. And he realizes the writing is in Sanskrit, which then this discovery sets off a plundering financed by the European monarchs and institutions, because these documents will also give them cover for the geopolitical mapping of these areas. Tasha, did you want to share something about the document that's at the Bodleian Library now?
Yes, I think it shows us the role that chance can play in things, because the Taklamakan is a desert. It's very dry, and it preserves these kinds of birch bark and palm leaf manuscripts far better than they would have been preserved in India itself. So I think it's always important to keep in mind why these things are found where they are.
So there were people from all walks of all countries coming into these areas of the Taklamakan. So we have Sven Hedin from Sweden. We have Count Otani on the left, pictured here, from Japan. On the right, we see Paul Pelliot from France. He was a sinologist, spoke Chinese. He was a scholar as well. And then this is the late 19th century, and everything from the East, the Orient, is exotic. So it had a huge draw and attention. We see luminaries, I guess, like Baron Gustav Mannerheim, who later becomes the president of Finland. But our presentation is going to focus on Sir Mark Aurel-Stein, who is the consummate scholar. He is not about glory. He is through and through an academic. And Tasha, you've used his Sir India, yes?
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind with Aurel-Stein, and you can see this in the books, this is but a small fraction of what he published. He published a tremendous lot, but also what he published was very useful because he would talk about where he went, what he found. He would publish pictures of what he found, which means you can often backtrack things from, for example, collections in the British Museum and determine the years that he found things. And given the fact he found things over a long period of time because he went back on multiple trips, it's extremely useful. So in contrast to somebody like Sven Hedin, who's more interested in writing a travel document that's supposed to be entertaining more, this is something that you really can use for scientific research.
So this is 1900 to the date, and because of his discovery, Hornley is continuously being sent lots of document that is being found now in the Taklamakan. It's been sent to him by the British Consul George Macartney. And then Aurel-Stein suspects some of them may be forgeries. So he wants to verify. And so in 1901, he tracks down who he suspects is the forger, Islam Akhund, and his partner, Ibrahim Mollah. And it is true, he had forged a bunch of these documents because when he sees foreigners and Europeans coming in looking for manuscripts, he says, why not? And there were some genuine manuscripts that Islam Akun had found. And he and his partner, Ibrahim Mollah, starts making copies. And he's clever enough that he smokes them and he dyes them in birch dye to make it look old. So he did put a lot of thought in this, but he certainly couldn't read this. So he just jumbled different languages together. And that's what gave him away, because more and more documents were needed. He couldn't keep up with demand. And so his partner and he carved out the books onto wood blocks and started making multiple prints. That is what made R.L. Stine very suspicious. But here is this, what I find central to R.L. Stine. He was not really about humiliating a fellow scholar. Tasha, do you want to talk about the letter?
Yeah, so R.L. Stine had figured out, because he'd gotten a confession, that these manuscripts were faked. And instead of making it public and say an article or something which would have terribly humiliated Hornley, he wrote to Hornley privately. And he also did it very sensitively. So he said things like, well, he was very clever in what he did, which actually he was. I mean, if you look at this, it is a very clever forgery. So this was actually true as well, which helped. And so his main goal was not to make Hornley feel bad, but to make Hornley understand, yes, it's fake, but no, don't feel bad that you've been taken in. And I really admire that about him.
Because R.L. Stine realized there was some original documents that Islam Akun was making copies of. He decided to put together a team to discover if there were more. And this is the journey that he takes around starting 1904, takes him across the Karakoram range, which on the extreme west end includes borders of Tajikistan, Afghanistan, goes across the Himalayas here, and then into the Taklamakan. Eventually, he'll get to this place of Dunhuang, which is just southwest of the Gobi. And as he's crossing the Tajikistan, remember, it's important for us to know that the Silk Road wouldn't exist with the glacial melts of the Himalayas. All the oasis stops along the Silk Road needs water. So it's very dependent on the glacier melt. And we see here, what necessity is the mother of invention. They probably ate the goats. And when the glacial comes and you have unexpected flood, they made rafts by blowing up the goat skin. Everything is used. They made rafts to get across the rapids. And the travel danger of acquiring these manuscripts, it's not a walk in the park. It's really perilous. You're covering precipitous terrains. Eventually gets to the Lop Desert. And this dog, I know Lauren has a dog here. This is the one steady companion of Dr. Stine. He had many dogs. And like Queen Victoria, he named all of them Dash. And the other steadiness in the Silk Road are these Bactrian camels, because they could withstand the temperature fluctuations and make do with little water. Dr. Stine, along with being a great scholar, he had a very disciplined background. He had a military background. So he planned things meticulously. And so these camels often were used to send up ahead blocks of ice. So when they got to this area, there would be water waiting for them, because they didn't have GPS. The travel demands a lot of discipline. That's something that I really admire about R.L. Stine. He gets to this place on Dunhuang, and some of you have probably been there. And 16 miles from Dunhuang are these Magao caves, which Magao means peerless caves. And this is his black and white picture. These holes you see coincide with the ones here. And these caves are an homage to the Buddhist caves in India, in the Ajanta Ellora. They've been commissioned by the wealthy during those times, around 9th, 10th century onwards, to carve out, because it helps the Buddhist practitioners who commissioned them acquire merit. And in here is the inside. There were more than 400 caves in the entire Dunhuang structure in Mogao caves. And they were being preserved by this Taoist priest, Wang Wanlu. And again, this speaks to Dr. Stine's attribute as a human being. He earns the trust of the priest. Dr. Stine makes a contribution to help preserve the temples, and Wang Wanlu allows Dr. Stine to take thousands of manuscripts, because he had found, the Taoist priest, a small side chamber on one of the caves, cave 16 or 17, that housed thousands of manuscripts from floor to the ceiling. Tasha, there was something that I found very interesting when you and I were talking. Would you like to share with the audience?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, obviously this speaks to the rich patronage of the individuals who endowed these caves, but more importantly, when I see this cave, it makes me very sad. And why? because when I see this, you see here this sort of unobstructed vista of paintings. But the sad thing is that as explorers discovered these caves and visited them, they decided it would be a good idea to take the bits of the caves home with them. So you have caves now where they've actually cut out pieces of these frescoes and took them away.
I call your attention to this decoration on the top. This motif is going to show up more and more. It's in 18 of the caves, this 3 hares motif. You see it on the top picture in a church in England. And this 3 hares, no one knows where it comes from. They don't believe it originated in China. It probably came from somewhere in the Mesopotamia and radiated out. So it's in China, it's also in Mesopotamia, which lends credibility to this idea that along with objects, motifs, stories, designs, religion traveled up and down the Silk Road. And I just wanted to show you this because it's one of my favorite things that I discovered while researching for this. This terracotta statue of 2 monkeys in an embrace, it's in the 9th century. Dr. Stein discovered it in 1907. And the moment I saw this, it reminded me of the sculpture by Brancusi. Now, I'm not saying Brancusi was influenced by this, and that's not the point. The reason I'm showing this, although coincidentally, it was discovered in 1907 and Brancusi designed or constructed it between 1907 and 1908, the remarkable synchronicity of the two. Why do we have to call or label any art? The monkeys on the left don't look primitive to me. They look thoroughly modern. Don't you think so, Tasha?
Yeah, and I mean, really, when you look at them, it's hard to believe that there's 1,000 years separating them. I mean, if somebody showed these to you without a label, you would not know that. And what it says to me, of course, is that nothing is ever original. So I'm sure Brancusi thought he was being most fashionable, but in reality, he was just sort of repeating things that we'd already seen, whether he knew it or not, which I just think is so interesting.
But what Dr. Stein is most famous for, he is credited having discovered the earliest dated complete woodblock printed manuscript. Truth be told, he had brought this to England. He didn't know what he found because he was not a sinologist. He couldn't read this because this document, the Diamond Sutra, is the Chinese translation of the Sanskrit treatise of the Buddha. And it's called the Diamond Sutra because the point is it's the diamond that cuts through illusion. Paul Pelliot, the sinologist from France, later realized what it was and he made them understand that because it currently resides in the British Library. It's 16 foot long. And because of the colophon and the frontispiece, we know that this was made. And by the way, I just put this picture there. In fact, Tasha had a great suggestion to give us an idea how long these things are. These are the Book of the Dead that is found in the Egyptian Museum in Turin. One has to walk through a tunnel to see these. So this Diamond Sutra, as we see here, had been put together 7 panels with a lot of backing hung up on the wall before at the British Library. It's since been restored over a 10-year process and packed away back in the panel format. And here is a close-up of the colophon, which lets us know when it was. There is a woodblock publishing. Actually, Tasha, would you help elucidate that woodblock printing versus the printing of the Gutenberg Bible? Because although technically this document precedes the Gutenberg Bible by 600 years, it's not a fair comparison.
No, it's not, because basically what they did was they took blocks and you would carve the script into the block. So you would have these big blocks which would have the entire part of that particular part which you were printing, instead of Gutenberg Bible, which is movable type. So each individual letter has its own block and you can move it around, right, in sort of a frame. And the reason that they did this, the Chinese actually did invent movable type, but because there were so many Chinese characters, they invented it after the woodblock. They decided that it was too expensive, really, and too labor intensive to actually use movable type. So even though they had it, it was not super popular.
So they had, I think, about 10,000 characters. It isn't worth the while to move them around. But the colophon indicates that this was printed in May 11th, 1868, commissioned by Wang Shi to get accrue merit, because that's a theme that runs through Buddhism. Same reason that the caves had been commissioned. And here's a close-up of the Diamond Sutra. If one looks of the frontispiece, which is one of the most recognized pieces now, these tears that probably belong to the original document has since been fixed. When it was discovered and brought back to England in the British Library in 1914, the conservators there then realized it was covered in this gold dust, and they didn't know what it was. So one of the first things they did, because one does what one knows, They washed it in water. When I read that, I would gasp. Luckily, it was just water and not chlorinated water, because they figured, what is this yellow dust? Not knowing that when this scroll was made, they used to cover them in this cork dye called berberine, which is insecticide. And it works on multiple levels because yellow was the imperial color of China. And so in Chinese Buddhism, yellow is co-opted for the color of the Buddha. Now, after restoration, as I had said before, these are kept away in panels in a box. But Tasha, I loved what you discovered and what your view of the carvings itself as the Buddha sits in a grove of tree.
Yeah, well, what I love about this is that if you see in the bottom center, you see there's this lion with his tongue hanging out and this giant floofy tail. And there's really this sort of sense of fun. He's also staring at another lion who's up a bit further. And, you know, what it shows us is that, you know, we can have a very religious manuscript, but it doesn't mean that we can't have fun at the same time. So you get a real sense of who the artist was by looking at this kind of text. They're like, okay, yes, it's a religious text, but we don't have to be all, you know, reverent and silent. No, we can enjoy it.
It aligns well with what the Dalai Lama says, the purpose of life is joy. And it is a joyous thing. And this is probably how Dr. Stein found it. Have you handled scrolls, Tasha?
No. Well, sort of. I mean, and the reason I say no and sort of is because you would never hand someone a scroll. Why? Not one that like this. Because if you can imagine what would happen if somebody handed me this and said, unroll it, you can imagine how that could potentially not end well for the scroll. So what they do actually is they tend to sandwich these scrolls between glass. And a lot of times if the scrolls are particularly long, they'll chop them up. So you get these, because obviously trying to handle a large piece of glass is very unwieldy. And so then what will happen, in this case, they don't just hand it to you and say, go have fun, or like they do with the illuminated manuscripts. It's more like, okay, we're going to sit it flat on the desk. We're going to watch you. You are not to turn it over yourself usually. They usually have to do it. Why? Because it's so fragile. Because what if you dropped it on the floor? What that would do is the glass would break and it would shred the bits of scroll in the glass, potentially. The other problem now that we didn't used to have to worry about, but we do now, is you have to be really careful when you're leaning over that your phone doesn't fall and go kerthunk and obviously split the glass. So it's scrolls are, well, it's all stressful, but scrolls are quite stressful.
So this picture is just to give you an idea. It's not just enough in the story of acquisition to find
Nope, I'm on Zoom.
You have to bring them back. Tasha, you told a very interesting story to me about acquisition that happened with the Oriental Institute. I think the audience would love that one.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, it's really dangerous to bring things back on boats, for instance. So you often have accidents where boats can sink. You know, you can see here how hazardous it can be. I mean, for example, those of you who may have seen the Lamasu in the Oriental Institute will know that that actually it floated down the river in Iraq before they took it by ship. The interesting thing is, and so it was actually funny, Shoma, you should ask about this, because right before this, I was checking to see the story about the boat with the torpedo. You remember I was telling you. So yeah. And I can't find it anywhere. So it's one of these things where I was checking to see the exact information. And so we'll all have to stay tuned for more information on that story. So
what Tasha is saying, there was a boat that was bringing more objects back to America. And one of these boats around World War I time had been torpedoed. So somewhere in the Caribbean is a shipwreck holding a lot of objects from this era. It's fascinating. And the story of acquisition itself is fascinating, but it brings up, how does one produce documents like this? And we now start with the story of production. This is the same document that Tasha had brought to your attention before, the Jami al-Tawarik in Edinburgh University. This is an unfinished picture, which is a perfect way of showing how are these documents made. We are going to start with the Rusbihan Quran. This resides now in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. And commissioned books are expensive, without a doubt. But when we see this amount of ultramarine and gold lavished on a document, what it signals is exorbitant wealth. So the Rusbihan Quran is called so because it was credited to the master illuminator, Rusbihan Muhammad al-Tabi al-Shiraz, the al-Shiraz part indicating that it's from the town of Shiraz, which was a center point of manuscript building. This is around 1550, the 16th century, and it's been credited to Shah Tahmasp. And it's a 445-page folio. So each page is this lovingly made. And I want to share with you why I gasp. So this amount of gold in ultramarine is expensive, but look at the real details after this. I'm going to point, if you can see, so this gold foil, and it's both gold leaf and gold paint. So they made gold paint by taking the mineral, mixing it with Arabica gum, and putting it in mollusk shells. That's how that one made gold paint, and also silver paint. And it's called shell gold because it was held in those shells. So regardless of what they are using, and these are zoom in pictures. So I'm zooming in on sections of this. So these are minutia. I have no doubt some went blind creating these. They take the gold, and I'm just zooming in. You can see these indentations. It's throughout each page. And why is that so? Because what they do is they make these indentations and they make the surface uneven. And so the Quran is read 5 times a day. And the Imam, who is the priest in Islam, would not need to read a Quran. He's probably memorized it. But the point is, when it's being read out loud and you see this book, just as the Lindau Bible, you see this book in by the candlelight, the flickering of the candlelight gets picked up by the uneven surface. And so the words on the manuscript shimmer and they float across the surface. And the devotee transcends as the word reaches off the pages. The word of God elevates everyone. The imagination put into creating a document like this just leaves me speechless. The time, the resource, the ingenuity. And I wanted to share this because the details are staggering. The same ultramarine, and remember, ultramarine is one of the most costliest paints around. So, and it also absorbs every other paint. So in the paint culture, you cannot it will absorb whatever paint you put on top of it. So this orange, which was probably made of this pigment, realgar, it is also a toxic paint. If it had been put on ultramarine, it would have been absorbed by the paint. So there's a sequence in how you make these. They first went in, sunbound very carefully, painted these thin gold lines, and the rest of the ornamentation, the apricots, the light blues, the oranges. And then another illustrator comes in and fills in the spot with ultramarine. And I'm going to zone in to share with you, look at the gingerness by the edges in many of these places. It just shows us, if I'm handling this miniature, I'm very careful that I don't put ultramarine over the gold paint lines. And so the sequence matters, who's doing what, because you certainly don't want ultramarine, this costly paint, to sit there and dry up on your paintbrush along with gold paint. It's phenomenally expensive. And so time frame wise, it's the same lapis lazuli that is used to create ultramarine, because Michelangelo, that Renaissance great artist, works at the same time as Rusbian. Ultramarine comes from, bless you, whoever that was, comes from these areas in Afghanistan, Sarasang mines. It radiates out to all the artists from that period who want it, a Michelangelo and a Rusbian. And we know that Michelangelo, his one unfinished painting, The Entombment, which is in the National Gallery, hadn't been finished because the ultramarine hadn't arrived. And blue has spiritual, the colors are spiritual across the ages. Blue is the color of the Virgin Mary. But look what they do, what a Rusbian does with ultramarine versus a Michelangelo. And the other thing that I found very interesting, because a friend of mine who's on this call loves color theory, Nancy, isn't it interesting that blue and orange, which we see in these paintings, look at the color, the orange and the blue. It surprised me that I don't see a predominance of green in the Rusbian Quran, because green is the color of the Islamic religion. But here's the same color combination, the striking combinations of blue and orange, and they're opposite each other on the color wheel. It's beyond impressive, the amount of learning that goes into becoming an illustrator. And there's a whole team. They're illustrators, the calligraphers, the framer, because all the pages are framed. And the sheer process when you're making this, illustrator comes and does the background, then comes the calligrapher. And what happens if the calligrapher needs more space? Sometimes he goes outside the lines. Other times, when he's filled in and there's space left, the illustrator comes back and fills it in. And these pages, as we had seen in the Akwon Yunlu Quran, pages came from China, because China was a master at creating burnished gold page. And we have archives of the cost, the money that Safavids paid to get this paper. But then they treated the paper also to get this background pink, this pink came from the yellow safflower, which they used to dye pink. Tasha, could you explain that these little flowers we see in here are not just for ornamentation?
Yeah, so those are verse markers. So it's important to keep in mind this is a beautiful book, but it's not just beautiful to be looked at. It's supposed to be beautiful to hear. This was meant to be read. And we know that because we have these little sort of hints for someone who is reading it. So basically those rosettes would tell you to take a breath at the end of the verse. You can see what look like slash marks and sort of a comma above the Arabic, which tells you how to pronounce it, because a lot of times, because Arabic isn't generally, there aren't vowels written. And so you again, all of this would tell you what to do. So it's also, as I say, it's not just a beautiful manuscript, but a lot of the things that you see in it have a practical use.
So I wanted to show that frame mark because the green in that frame is also made of copper, and copper, just as in the Black Hours book, which is in the Morgan with the black vellum background, copper is corrosive. And so that demands a lot of conservation effort because it tears through. And once again, preservation of these documents are extremely important when we have these. And the pink that I've referred to, pink made of the safflower, it wasn't enough that they created the dye. Look how they apply it to this gold burnished paper. You can see that it's been applied, it's been speckled, it's been sponged. Other times they just wash the paper in pink. The sheer imagination in creating these, the artistry of this, it's eye-wateringly beautiful. And one more thing, I mean, I could just go on. I seem to be going on with them anyway. These panels are an example of the expertise of the illustrators, because there's a team, framers, illustrators, calligrapher, and the master calligrapher, Uzbeyan. But in the rinsal, which is fancy art term to show vines with leaves, look at the difference. Tasha, didn't you just love that little detail?
Yeah, I mean, for me,
No, I didn't, Shoma. I got bored by it.
No, I mean, what I love is that you always see new things when you look at manuscripts like this. So, for example, if you look, you can see that the Rinceau vine decoration on the far left is much sparser than the two in the one in the middle and the one on the right. And what that tells me while looking at this is I can see, and also the way the flowers are drawn, these are different artists. So I know that the person on the far left is another artist. And this reminds us again that these are collaborative efforts. So we know about Rusbihan, but we don't know about all his assistants who were also, laboring away on this manuscript. So that's what's beautiful, is that you can see the spirit of collaboration in all of this.
And once again, the concept of motif in the Silk Road, one motif that travels, just as we had spoken of the three hairs motif. The motif that travels in the Islamic world along the Silk Road is the Shamsa, the sun, that which opens up the Quran, it illuminates the book. And the details of the Shamsa should be more relevant to us and more, evident to us now. And the same Shamsa shows up again in the Badshanama of Shah Jahan of the Mughal period. And this Timurud Quran, which predates the Safavid, so this is around the times this is right before the time of the Mongols coming. And we know that because here's the Shamsa, and from the previous presentation, here are the roundels that eventually will incorporate more nature when the Mongols relocate Chinese artists into Iran. But this Timurud copy from 15th century made as a gift from India, it's a great segue point to our next section, because in the margins you see writings. The black is in Arabic, the red is in Persian, which brings us to the next section of our story of deconstruction, a marvelous document, the Shah Abbas Bible, which resides in the Morgan, because it too has very interesting stories in the margin. And Tasha, take it away.
All right. Well, so the Shah Abbas Bible, you might wonder why it has all these names. And one of the reasons it has all these names is, as you can see from the stars, it's had a long life, with its production in Paris, then moving to Italy, then going to Poland, and in the beginning of the 17th century being sent to Isfahan in Iran, ending up in the 19th century in Cairo, where it was collected and then sold at auction in London, and finally ending up mostly, as we'll see, at the Morgan Library at the beginning of the 20th century. So if we go to the next slide, we can see.
If I may interrupt, how is it when you, because I know you've been to the Morgan, and I know Diane, who's been on this presentation, has been to the Morgan Library as well. How is it when you go to the Morgan to work?
Well, so I haven't actually worked at the Morgan, but when you and sadly, or maybe not, the Morgan reading room, because I've looked into going there, I just haven't, to do research, is in a different building, is a different part of the building. But this the original library. The purpose of this, remember, Pierpont Morgan's one of the most powerful men in the world. The purpose of this library is to show off and intimidate anybody who comes in. And having worked in historic libraries, and I've already talked about the stress of being handed antique manuscripts, when you're in surroundings like this that create this sort of grand feeling, you feel even more pressure because you're sitting in this historic building looking at this historic manuscript, and you're just kind of like, so it's definitely an intimidating space, in my opinion.
All right.
Yeah. So the Shah Abbas Bible, so you look at this and you're thinking, well, this is not looking Persian. This does not look like what we've been looking at. And of course it's not, because it was made in Paris in the 1240s, probably for Saint Louis, the King of France. And originally when this manuscript was created, there were no captions. So ignore everything you see. That's why it was known as the Picture Bible, because basically, in contrast to the other materials which we've been looking at, which were meant to be read, this was meant to be looked at. And so what that meant was they very carefully constructed these scenes because they assumed that you would know what they were. Of course, now we're sort of like, I don't know, some headless guy maybe. But it's one of these things.
Ichabod Crane.
Yes, precisely. So they didn't have any captions. But Shoma, if you turn to the next slide, we can see how this worked. So they did add captions, and these were added over time. And so I've highlighted the different captions so you can see when they were added. So in the yellow, you can see the Latin caption, and this caption was added after St. Louis died. We believe, although we're not sure, that the manuscript was given to his brother, Charles of Anjou, who was ruling Naples. And sometime in the 14th century, someone realized what we all realized which is, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. Quick, add captions to suggest I know what I'm looking at. And I might add that not all these captions are right. And in fact, on this page, almost all these captions are wrong. So they missed the boat entirely. But in any case, so they added the captions. And then when it was given by the Polish cardinal to Shah Abbas looked at this and went, I really have no idea what's going on here. Please add Persian captions to inform me. So the black box, which you can see there, are the Persian captions. And then in 1722, Isfahan was sacked by the Afghans, and the Afghans seem to have dispersed the library. And we believe it is at that time that the manuscript fell into private hands, and specifically someone who was Jewish, and I'll get to why we know that in a second, someone who is of the Jewish community. There was a large Jewish community in Iran at the time, and he added captions, and you can see those captions in purple. And he's the only one who got it right, although initially they got it wrong, but he corrected himself to the right thing. So what is this? This script looks like Hebrew, but it's not. So Shoma, if you can turn, I'll explain what this is. This is what is known as Judeo-Persian. So this script here is not, but the one previous caption is. Judeo-Persian is basically is the Persian language written in the Hebrew script. Why did they do that? This is because the Jewish community would learn to read and write Hebrew, because obviously they're trying to read the Bible and other religious texts, so they would learn Hebrew. But of course at home, they wouldn't speak Hebrew, they would speak Persian. So if it came time then to write out what you thought, you would turn to the language, the alphabet that you knew. So the Hebrew would stand in for the Persian language. And we can also see this on the right. This is the Ducas Horants. This is a heroic epic, which is written in Middle High German variant that's a precursor of Yiddish. And again, it's Hebrew, but the script, but the language is German. And both of these documents, just to confuse the matter even more, are from Egypt. So they're actually from the so-called Cairo Geniza, which is this treasure house of documents, medieval and later documents found in Cairo. So it's one of these things where you look at these things and you think it's one thing, but then it turns out to be another. So if you continue on, Shoma. Right, so if you look at this leaf, this is not in the Morgan, this is in the Getty. So what happened? If you look at this manuscript, you'll see Latin, you'll see Persian, but you will not see Judeo-Persian. So nothing that looks like Hebrew on this page. Why? Well, we think what happened was basically that Shah Abbas had the Bible explained to him and did not like what he found. Why? Because his son had revolted against him and the Shah Abbas had to unfortunately execute him. And in the pages, the offending pages which were removed, depicted David and Absalom, where it ended equally poorly. And so we know that it had to have been taken out of the Bible before the Bible was looted in the 18th century because of the lack of the Judeo-Persian captions. So one leaf eventually ended up in the Getty, and two more in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and we're still searching for the rest. But as you can see, it's a very distinctive book. So if you ever see anything that looks like this, you'll know what you've got.
Yes, this folio of the Shah Abbas Bible has about 48 originally, right, Tasha?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's a great point to bring about manuscripts being deconstructed. That's why this section is called that. This is called the Houghton Shahnameh. Originally, it should have been called Tahmasp Shahnameh because it was made by the Sultan Shah Tahmasp, who's the son of Ismail, who was the man who actually commissioned this book. This book took 20 years to finish from Iran, and Tahmasp is the man around the time who had commissioned the Ruzbiyan Quran. That's one of the reasons I brought this up. Currently, it resides in the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. This is a single page folio from that book that was intact for about 400 plus years. It sold at Sotheby's in 2011 for $12.19 or $15 million, one page. So Houghton, Arthur Houghton, who was a book lover, he has a great book collection. You have the Houghton Library in Harvard. When he had the book, for whatever reason, after him, this book starts getting separated and the pages have been sold. You see them all over the world. Keep in mind, I mean, I just gasped when I saw it. If you look at the drawing, so we see again the burnished gold Chinese paper. And there is the story. It's depicted as if the book is opening up and the story spills out like a pop-up book. I just love these. I really regret being an engineer. And then I'm going to zone in to show you what this is. Here is the ibex looking back, and I know there's a Penelope Bingham in here who loves the Odysseus, and I thought of you when I saw these rocks with the faces, as if the sirens that had tried to seduce Odysseus, and this marvelous horse, light blue, and you can see the Mongol influence in the drawing because it's from the Safavid period, after the Ilkhanids, after the Mongols have ruled and gone. And here again is the Mongol influence because they had resettled populations from China, the artisans, into Iran and back whenever they needed it. And here comes that one dragon that's across both geographies, and the marvelous snow leopard here. And I don't know what this is. It's certainly not a dog, but I think it's super cute, snarling at the snow leopard. It's just, as Tasha had said before, fun. There's a great sense of fun because the Shahnameh is the epic poetry of Iran, written by Ferdowsi in the 10th century. And he actually written it because he needed money to pay for his daughter's wedding. He didn't get the money he wanted. In fact, the amount that he was given, he returned back. He died a poor man, but look at his skill. I just want artists like this who may not be as familiar to the outside world as a Michelangelo or a Tintoretto. I just think it's a nice way to give them their due credit. And one can be complex of Arthur Houghton, but I have no gray zones about this man, Demotte Shahnameh. This man, Demotte, was a gallery owner, and he bought Shahnameh. This is called the Demotte Shahnameh after him, unfortunately. People are more calling it the Ilkhanid Shahnameh. It once again tells the story, and the illustrations are a bit different, as well it should be. It's more Mongol style, because it was commissioned by Ghazan, the Mongol who had then converted to Islam. But what Demotte did was he separated the pages and deliberately sold them to recoup his cost, which is understandable. But what is deplorable is that he knew he forged it because he hired calligraphers to add on stories to the back. So he tampered with the document. And you see pages from his book in the Freer Gallery at the Harvard Fogg Library. And I just realized that every time I see a single folio being sold in any auction house or showing up in any museum, it belongs in a manuscript. And I just think they are marvelous. deconstruction has a complex story, as does most things. And this one is in the Oriental Institute. Tasha?
Yeah, so this is in the OI Museum, and once the OI opens again, you can come see it because it's out. And the reason it's so interesting for this purpose here is because this is a 19th century manuscript. So this is Qajar dynasty. We'll be returning to Qajars again. But what you can see here is what looks to be a collection of pen drawings, and that is indeed so. But what they did, and this was something that was very common for Persian manuscript collectors, was they actually thought nothing of cutting pages out and pasting them together in volumes like this, and these sort of accordion pull-out things that you can show to all your friends after dinner. And they thought this was a way of preserving the manuscript. So they did this because they loved these pieces so much and they wanted to see them together. And I think it's always important to keep that in mind, that people's reasons for doing things can be more complex than we think. And sometimes it's not just because people wanted money or, you know, this kind of thing, but actually because they loved it so much, which is a very interesting impulse, that you love something so much you want to destroy it and put it back together in a form that you think is better.
Yes, which brings us to the final stage of our story, which is the genealogy, the influence of the Silk Road on storytelling, because regardless of how beautiful the book is, and I found it very humorous, the Lindau Gospels bejeweled, but the one that's called the Diamond Sutra doesn't have a single studded gem on it whatsoever. But here you see the genealogy. The reason I chose the term is that all these stories that traveled, the provenance, in the truest sense, is the Silk Road itself, because stories traveled. And it's been around for a long time. An example is the story of the Panchatantra, which is from 300 BCE. It's a Sanskrit term for 5 treaties. It's a book of fables, animal fables. Over centuries, you will recognize it as stories, the French fables of La Fontaine. The same Panchatantra stories in different formats shows up in La Fontaine, and he acknowledges indebtedness to this Indian sage, which he calls Pilpai. But the one that I want to spend the remaining few minutes on, which is a dead giveaway from this picture here, is the Arabian Nights. Hazar Afsan. Tasha, this is the one from the Oriental Institute. You want to give a little background?
Yes. So we've gone from the very beautiful to the slightly less beautiful. So this is, again, in the OI Museum. And again, you can see it once we're open again. It's in the same case as the other manuscript. So this is the world's oldest known 1001 Nights fragment. Now, I say 1001, you're looking at it and you're saying, but it says 1,000, Tasha. What do you mean? Well, so this is one of the rare instances where we have the title page. So this is a single page, so we're looking at the front and the back. And anyone who works in Egypt, who works on papyri or paper, as this is, will tell you that we never, ever, ever, ever find the beginning of a manuscript. We never find the title page. This never happens, but it did here, which was a good thing. Why? Because the manuscript on the far right, far left shows us the title, and the title tells us it's the Book of Tales of 1,000 Nights. And you're like, well, is this 1001 or isn't it? So if we go to the far right where the story starts, and you'll notice there's a whole ton of scribbling on this, and this is because this piece was reused over time. The story has the same characters as what we know of as 1001 Nights. And of course, it breaks off before we get to the story. Naturally, we can't have everything. But we know enough to know it's the same people. It's just not the same stories that survive in what we know as 1001 Nights. Now, why was it called this, and why is there an extra night? What happened to the extra night in the beginning? Well, 1,000 just meant a lot. There weren't 1,000 stories in this particular manuscript. There might have been, there could have only been 20, maybe 30, maybe 100. We're not sure, obviously, because we only have the page, but we know it was a lot. And of course, 1,001, again, means a lot. So it doesn't mean literally that that's how many stories were in there. It just means there were many, many stories.
If we renamed it now, I suggest we call it a gazillion nights. It would be,
well, yes, quite.
Gazillion nights. So the story starts. So the Arabian Nights is an absolutely European concoction, credited to, at some level, Antoine Galland, a Frenchman. He happened to be a secretary to the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during Louis XIV's time, the Sun King. Louis XIV had a love baubles from the Orient, which included, India, whatever, and then Egypt. And so he used to be secretary. So he spoke a lot of languages, Arabian, Persian, Turkic. And when he was in his 60s, he came across this document, which is now in the, I think it's in the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's called the Galland manuscript. He read stories in here. And remember the fontaine that I've mentioned? So the milieu is that people want these exotic stories. So there was a demand for stories. And so he translated some of these stories, as is evident in the notations in French. He took these stories and he translated them. So the original Arabia 1001 Nights had 0 illustrations. As you can tell in this, there are no illustrations there. He writes them down. The story gets published in serialized form, and it's a definite hit. And in this is happening from 1704 onwards. In 1706, this is one of the rare copies of the Galland document. And this frontispiece is very interesting because, as anybody who's been in the Middle East and the Central Asia will know, here is the essence of this Arabian Nights. Scheherazade telling the story to Shahryar, sitting on a 4-poster bed. First of all, they would never be on the same bed. And there's her sister, Dinarzad, who had started the storytelling process. Be that as it may, it's a huge popular thing. And so it's copied in England. And I love this little story. The Sultan, let me stop this, to divert the Sultan from the execution of a bloody vow, had made to marry a lady every day. Now that makes sense to the English audience because Henry VIII married a new lady, 6 new wives. So to marry 6 new wives is nothing compared to having a new wife every day. They have to catch up. But as we see, because of the demand for the stories, how he's going to come up with the remaining few hundred stories. And we then come to this character called Hana Diab. So because of Louis XIV's demand for exotic baubles, there was a man called Paul, I think it's Lucas, isn't that right, Tasha? Mm-hmm. He was a treasure hunter, effectively a tomb raider. And around this time in Paris, there were many Syrian Christians. And one young man who was in his 20s, Hana Diab, was a translator for Paul Lucas, the treasure hunter. Lucas had been to Syria, and in this town called Idlib, Hana Diab says later in this manuscript, which is effectively his diary, he writes that Lucas had asked this one local shepherd to go on a vault underneath the ground to see what's in that vault. And the shepherd comes out with a ring and a lamp. It should sound familiar to us because that's the story that then becomes Aladdin, because when Hana Diab works for Lucas, what had happened is around after the 1704, when it's a huge popular hit, the publisher for Galland wanted more stories. He didn't have it. So under Galland's name, he published some other stories. And Galland got really angry. So he went to visit his friend Paul Lucas, finds Diab, and Diab comes from Syria, a place where there are coffee houses and there are professional storytellers. So he knows a lot of story. So he supplies stories such as Aladdin, such as Ali Baba, which is then Galland puts into his book. And Tasha, I want you to say that just the idea of this thing of not getting credit.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I think it's so important to talk about Hana Diab, because what nobody knew was that because of and in fairness to Galland, he was under a lot of pressure because he had this book that was a huge hit, but there weren't even 300 stories in it. So we're talking about how 1001 Nights isn't 1001. And to his cost, Galland had learned this. And so he's really desperate at this point. And, Hana Diab tells him the stories of Aladdin, tells him the stories of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, which are quintessential 1001 Nights stories now, right? But weren't in the original manuscripts ever. And so, of course, Galland puts it in there. And he passes it off as being part of the story, because obviously if he says, well, I met this guy and this guy told me this story, nobody's going to read it. It doesn't, fit into the overall milieu, right? But then, of course, what happened was, and people couldn't figure out why they could never find Aladdin and Ali Baba in the other Arabic versions, because there's other Arabic manuscripts, and they're like, well, where is it? And so finally, at the end of the 19th century, this one 1001 Nights scholar went to the Bibliothèque Nationale, and he was looking at the manuscript, which you saw, but also at Galland's diary, and to his shock, discovered, that in fact, that these stories had been told by Hana Diab to Galland. And then we discovered, and it's available in French, but it should be out in English at some point, Hana Diab's autobiography, which you can see here in the Vatican. And in there, Hana Diab talks about how he met the old man. I can only imagine what Galland thought of being described in such a way. And he, he told him these stories and how happy Galland was. And it's like, yeah, I bet Galland was seeing, I guess it would be French franc signs or something, And so I think it's really important to, when we talk about the 1001 Nights, to give credit to Han Diab, because we don't know, of course, if he told these stories because he had heard them, if he invented them, basing them on, or combined them with things like the story of finding this lamp in a cave, all of these things. So, giving him the credit, I think, is really important.
And so we are giving credit. Now I want to focus on the beauty of these books, because they were not illustrated before, and the illustration comes in. In 1719, because the serialized version comes from 1704 to 1717. In 1719, we see the David Costa illustrations, where he puts in the margins of the front of the title cover, the stories they are drawn in. And in 1839, the Englishman, an ethnographer, who had been to Egypt, he wants authenticity. He wants the Arabian Nights stories to be educational. So he gives the illustrator William Harvey engravings of Turkish and Moorish engravings to give an authenticity. And I have to point out that Arabian Nights is a funny name to give to stories which are Persian. Persian is in Arabia. It's not. But then beauty always takes precedence. In 1865, and those who love books, and there are many in the audience, the illustrator Sir John Tenniel is the one who illustrated the Alice in Wonderland. There are his marvelous illustrations on the left. And this on the right is the first color illustrations in 1878 by Walter Crane. And it's important because in the original writing, if you call it original, of Galland, he had set the story of Aladdin in China. And the description is rather Burmese, actually, but it's in the Far East. And so for authenticity, it's pun intended, Walter Crane drew the drawings in China. And keep in mind, in 1878, everything Oriental, all with the story of tea, everything exotic is China. Also, it's colored. And it's made for children. So the previous ones were made mainly for adults. And we move on to 1885, because Arabian Nights are not clean. Up to this point, these stories are very pristine and conservative and proper. Richard Burton, a very interesting man, and because of time, we have to skip some of the stories. He writes the smutty version of the real story, incorporating homosexuality, castration, incest. It's fabulously done. But he doesn't illustrate it because he knows he'll be sued for obscenity. And so he prints the smutty one in a private collection. You pay for that one, but he prints a cleaner version under Lady Burton's edition. But he's cunning. What he did is he had the Arabic translations of the French story. So it's been back translated into Arabic. And then he translates the Arabic version into English and says, oh, these are authentic stories. People buy it. 10 years later, this illustrator called Albert Letchford, he goes to town and draws out all the scandal. I'm sure it was a huge hit. And as we move on, I love Arthur Rackham. His illustrations are just marvelous. But I juxtapose it with the one by Edmond Dulac, the French one, because here you see the influence of the Silk Road. Here's Sindbad by Rackham. Here's Sindbad by Edmond Dulac, but Dulac was influenced by 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Isn't it just staggeringly beautiful, and the connection across the board? And you see this influence again when we get to the illustrations from 1917, marvelously done by the Danish artist K. Nielsen. And you see the Buddhist influence in the costumes of the stories. And in terms of being charmed, Errol LeCain, the British illustrator, is just a marvel. I mean, full of color. I encourage you to see these. And the internet's lovely that you see all of it. But here it comes full circle. The Arabian Nights, in whatever form you call it, 1000, 1001, they were never illustrated in Central Asia. And because it was such a huge success in Europe, they started illustrating it. And could you talk a little bit, since we are running out of time, on the Qajar documents here? If you don't mind, if you would discuss 3 more minutes, I think then we'll be done.
Yeah, so just very quickly, because as Shoma said, we're running out of time. But the thing is that as she mentioned, they didn't illustrate 1001 Nights in the Middle East, but suddenly in the middle of the 19th century in Qajar, Iran, they decided to make up for it with this document on the far left. So there's 6 volumes with over 3,000 illustrations with over 40 artists, which took 7 years. So they went crazy. And apparently it was such a terrible experience, they never did it again. So this is the only example of I mean, we have lithographs, but we don't have painted, illuminated manuscripts of 1001 Nights from the Middle East. This is the only one. And what you can see that they did was they put the characters, just as we've seen in the Western illustrations, they made them sort of modern in the way that they put them in costumes that made sense to them. So they're dressed in the height of Qajar fashion. And if you look at the women on the bottom, you'll see that they have quite long skirts. And this contrasts slightly with the photograph on your right. So this is from the Oriental Institute's collection. This is one of over 150 photographs primarily by the Iranian-Armenian photographer Antoine Severdine, who you can see here. And the woman sitting here, so this is about 30 years after this manuscript, her skirt is much shorter. And you're kind of like, well, why is that? Well, that's because Nasser al-Din Shah, who is the leader of Iran, both when the manuscript was produced as well as the photographs, he went to Paris and saw ballerinas and thought, ooh, tutus, I like it. I'll bring it back and make everyone wear it. And well, they did. So she's actually wearing a Iranian interpretation of a French tutu. And this is her, you know, the dress she would wear at home. And you can see Severdine was a very careful photographer. So she's posed in a very Western manner. You can see there's no shadows because he would photograph things at noon in order to do that. And further, she's on a carpet, which he adored. He loved carpets. And you can see in a courtyard even, you still have a carpet. And I think what this shows you is the influences going back and forth, because of course photography is obviously a Western invention, travels to Iran and becomes incredibly popular. So we can see how the exchanges are going in multiple ways.
When is your catalog coming out, Tasha?
Yeah, so this was actually, thank you, Shoma, for plugging that. This is basically, I'm doing an exhibition on the photography of Antoine Severdine. It was supposed to open in September of this year, but because of COVID-19, it's going to open September of 2021. But my catalog is actually coming out this year. So hopefully November-ish, it'll be out. And basically all the photographs will be published. There'll be studies, all these things. I'm actually working on it right now as we speak. Well, not quite, but almost.
So what brings us to that, it's the influence, not just in the books, in the arts. This Rodin statue, torso of a young woman, it's documented. Rodin was highly influenced by the Chola bronze statues from India. He loved them. And speaking of love, this story continues in the final series on the Silk Road. It's going to be the effect of the Silk Road on performing arts, on culture. And that the most canonical masterpiece is humanity. And we will be telling that story with someone I absolutely love. Was to know him is to love him, Craig Trumpeter of Haymarket Opera. We will go over the influence in ballet, in music, in opera, in theater of the Silk Road that we borrow from each other. An example of this, the Bayader of the ballet, in the French ballet. Well, Bayader is not a French term. It's the Indian term Bayadre, which is the Indian term for a dancing girl. And the ballet is on a temple dancer. So I hope you join us on August 20th. And if you liked a presentation like this, next week on the Nourishment Projects, we have a presentation on the poetry of clouds. If you're interested, please go to the website or send me an email. I would love to share the story of clouds. And it's not about paintings. It's one of the most visually sumptuous presentations I've ever put together. Thank you so much for your time, and I apologize for going over by 4 minutes. Hopefully it wasn't, nobody's late for their, if anyone's interested, we can stick around for questions. Tasha, it's been such a joy working with you. Thank you. I hope you had fun, because I loved it.
Yeah,
working with you on this one.
It was great. And what, for me, I think, and I've said this to you, but I think it's also important that people see this, is that we always learn things. So, you know, because Shoma's like, oh, we're going to look at the rose behind Quran. I'm like, great. And then she shows these pictures, and I'm like, look, we can see multiple artists at work, you know. So I learned so much from these presentations too, because I see how you can see different things in different ways. So for me, it's also a lot of fun working on it, because I'm now looking at all these things in a different light.